back to Nafi's Not Facing Garden. In today's video, I'll be addressing container gardening, especially in the summer period. Now, before I go ahead, I'd like to say a big thank you to everyone who subscribed. I think recently I've had an increase in my sub count, which I'm very grateful and happy about. So if you enjoy my content, please keep watching, share with your friends, and yeah, we can learn together in this not facing space of mine. Right, so as I was saying, the summer is a critical period for container gardening, particularly pertaining to watering. And anyone who does a little bit of container gardening needs to be made aware of some of the issues that can crop up and how best to deal with them and prevent them. For example, I myself am relatively new to planting in containers, particularly roses. So early in the period, I had a David Austin's The Poet Wife rose, which I put in a container in one of my earlier videos. But on the day, I just came out to have a look at it, and I noticed that the plant looked really sad. The leaves were drooping, and it looked terrible, and I was shocked. But I realized immediately that it had to do with underwatering. Particularly, we've had a very hot spell. Same is happening in most parts of the world, where you've had a period of a heat wave and the plants are just struggling to cope. Particularly as we've placed them in a container, we have to just do our best to sustain them. So I'll briefly go through the list of things to watch out for and the signs that may indicate that your plant is actually suffering from underwatering. And I'll demonstrate with a recording that I have of my rose. So one of the first things you're going to notice is that the plant will go very floppy and limp, and it'll actually sometimes just fall over, depending on how tall the stems are. Another thing you might notice is that the leaves start to curl up and crisp up at the edges. In fact, it may be so severe that some of the leaves actually brown and turn crispy and papery. Another sign is that you're going to see the stems also drying up, and in a severe case you might actually have the plant actually dropping its leaves as a way to conserve moisture, because they perspire through the leaves, and they may try to drop off the leaves so that they can retain moisture for the rest of the plant. And if it's a chronic underwatering state for the plant, it'll actually fail to thrive. It may even sort of not flower, not produce crops. In worst case scenarios, it may actually die off, and it may get to the point where you're not able to retrieve it. But I haven't been through such an experience, so I'm not able to share on that. Now I'll go ahead and talk about the critical way to address this. Is all about watering your container gardens. My little experience so far. The first thing I would say is that you need to observe your containers compost. What I mean by this is you can give yourself a week during which you water and actually feel the top 1 to 2 inches of the soil. You can just dip your finger in a little bit and see how wet or dry it gets in between the watering frequency. Now bear in mind that this will vary from season to season. Like even in the summer, it will vary from time to time, and try to do this irrespective of the rainfall. So you will develop a habit. So you go in your container, dip your finger and see how wet. This is the best indication to tell you when the water level is low, irrespective of rainfall or highs and lows of temperature. So when you do this, you can form a pattern to know how much dryness happens in between watering, irrespective of rain conditions. So the next point I'll go through is actually the act of watering. For container plants, it's very important to have a big size container for the plant of choice. And again, I've addressed this in all the videos. I've talked about ensuring that your container, in as much as we're trying to water, we just don't want them waterlogged as well. So you have to make sure that you have an adequate drainage hole at the bottom. So what you're going to do when you're watering is you're going to water slowly and deeply. And because I've advised actually leaving at least 2 centimeters at the rim of the pot, so you can actually fill up your container with water and then let it drain slowly and ensure that the drainage is actually clear. So when this happens, you can repeat it and ensure that all the compost in the container is thoroughly wet. You do this slowly and then you let it drain. Some people like to place a saucer at the base of the pot. That way they know the water is actually gone through, but whichever way you do will be fine. So this is how to water properly. Again, you will have to adjust this depending on the weather. So this is why I mean that regular checking of your compost condition is actually the best indicator, and then with time you will build an understanding with the weather and your plant, and you can do this pretty much with everything. Of course, like, you have to respect the plant's water needs. Like if you have succulents and other drought tolerant plants, you have to do it differently. But as a general rule, if you always felt how wet or dry your compost is the best way to know when and how much to water. Now, having said that, the third point is actually very important, to still find a way to allow drying in between watering. When I say drying, I don't mean bone dryness. I just mean you allow the plant to develop in such a way that it actually uses up the water, but not go dry in between watering. So this is also very important for root development, because you don't want a state whereby the plant is constantly having its roots in water. Despite drainage, you don't want the plant to constantly have its root, because it will actually sort of deprive it of oxygen when there's excess water. So you still need to find a way to maintain, allow a period of dryness for the soil, but not bone dryness. I hope I haven't made this very much confusing, but it's just a delicate balance, and by the time you could do this over a period of a week and see how well you get on, and then depending on the weather you might have to make adjustments. But it's just something that once you get a hang of it with your plants, it becomes so simple, so much simpler, and then you can put yourself on a schedule. Depending on the weather, you know what happens. And I'll just advise, just be careful when there's rain, and don't always assume that rainfall equals, oh, my containers are wet. Just still have a look in your compost, and then it's the safest way to go about that. Now I've talked about watering. Now I'm going to talk about things you can actually do before planting to set yourself up for success. So the first thing, again, it might sound like a broken record, but the choice of container is very important in any gardening. For example, roses, they need very large pots, deep pots for their root development. Something like an acapanthus may be very happy in a crowded pot. So you just have to do a little bit of reading around what your plant prefers. It might even be a hanging basket. You know, the roots get really tangled. So you just have to maybe modify. If you want to add water retaining crystals, if you want to use a diaper, as some advocate. So you do things to your container to set it up for success to begin with. Now, the second thing you want to do is actually conserve your moisture. And there are things you can add. For example, mulching is a very nice way of going about retaining moisture in between watering. So you could use bark chips, you could use pot toppings like pebbles of different sizes. You could use a farmyard, like I use a thick layer of manure over my roses, just avoiding the stem. You can use a thick layer of mulch, I think about 2 inches of mulch. And there are so many beautiful things. Some people use pebbles, ornamental stones, glass, all sorts. Straw and other things will also help you conserve your moisture in between watering. Back to containers. In plastic containers, you have a little bit of a leeway in that unlike terracotta pots, they tend to hold moisture better. So these are other things that you can look ahead to and before you start container gardening. And also grouping up the plants together, like as a companion, they actually have shared shade. So sometimes the pots, when you group them together, they can actually provide shade for each other, and that's another thing to do about it. Now, the only part of this watering challenge is I have not actually had a plant that went bone dry, so I'm not able to share any experience on that. But I'm sure if you look around, there might be people who've actually maybe been away, or maybe you had a water irrigation failure and your plant went bone dry. There are ways to revive them, but because I don't have any experience of that, I'm not able to share. But please, if you have any additional tips that you would like to share in the comment section, I'll be very happy to read your comments. And because I'm relatively new to this, as I always say, there's always someone who knows more, and I'll be very happy if anyone wants to share their ideas and ways to go about this watering. but I just felt, I myself fell victim to the underwatering in a heat spell, and I know someone out there will probably want to know how to prevent this and how to go about their watering. So this is what works for me, and so far it's kept my plants happy. So with this, I've come to the end of this video. If you found this video useful, please like, comment, and share with your friends, and consider subscribing to my channel if you haven't. And if you have, thanks for sticking with me, and have a lovely day. Thank you.